Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
You can tell a lot about where a company is going by looking at where it's been. ConocoPhillips, Alaska's oil and gas company.
The National Weather Service.
Good Tuesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 14th of January. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with the latest forecasts, watches, warnings, and advisories, as well as current observations, and a look at the radar picture anytime by heading to weather.gov and clicking on Alaska. You can also look at the entire statewide view at arh.noaa.gov. Give us a call on the weather info line at 800-472-0391. Find each weather service in Alaska on Twitter, on Facebook under U.S. National Weather Service Alaska, and on YouTube. You can also search for AKWX TV and find this entire broadcast online, courtesy of Alaska Public, the station you're watching now. Again, after the show, find the entire Alaska Weather Show and previous shows there if you care to look back into weather history a little bit. Here's a look at the hazardous weather situation across the Gulf Coast as we head through tonight. Winter storm warnings and wind moving across southeast this afternoon. In fact, some gusts around Ketchikan made it up over 50 miles per hour earlier today, so a lot of wind and again snow falling across the region, likely turning over to rain, and again many more variations of that to come as we head through the next 48 to 60 hours as storms are just lined up across the Gulf. More on that in just a minute. Looking at South Central, we have freezing rain advisories posted for the Matanuska Valley as well as the Anchorage Bowl. That'll begin tomorrow and go through early Thursday morning. So freezing rain, while just a little bit, could certainly create some travel troubles there up and down the roads and make roadways and sidewalks slick. So be extra careful as freezing rain develops across the region is what we expected this time, at least in light amounts, as we head into Wednesday afternoon and Thursday morning. And then across the Arctic coast, wind chill advisories once again for values that could feel as cold as 55 below across a large part of the Beaufort Seacoast and the Chukchi Seacoast. For the St. Lawrence Seacoast as well as the western tip of the Seward Peninsula, we're looking at wind chill values there that could be as cold as 45 to 50 below. So a lot of colder, or at least that feels colder, kind of weather coming your way over the next 24 hours. And for southwestern Alaska, again, a freezing rain advisory there for areas mainly east of Dillingham, looking for about a tenth to 2/10 of an inch of freezing rain. That will be in effect tonight and into tomorrow. So watch for the latest information there again from the Weather Service. You can find that online in your weather radio, your local media station there in your village or community, and of course online at weather.gov. Here's a look at the big picture out to the west. It's pretty easy to see kind of the train of storms lined up. We've got one here about to move into the Gulf. We've got another weak area of low pressure here north of Shemya, and then another circulation here. This one looks kind of like a giant pinwheel or a lollipop almost stuck there. And you've got another storm, a little fetch of moisture east of Tokyo. So all this weather is lined up and positioned to make its way at least into some part of the Gulf of Alaska and affect Alaska in some way with either rain, wind, very warm weather, or perhaps a combination of all of those things. Now tonight in some places in south central and southeast you've had a little bit of rain and wind and snow. As we look at the situation here across the Aleutians, some of this will bring some stronger winds mainly south of the chain, but we're looking at pretty persistent areas of wind and at least rain and snow across a large part of the chain tonight, with colder weather pretty much all the way down toward the St. Matthew Island waters and farther south. Northerly winds will be the rule through the course of the rest of the week, it looks like. You'll see that in the marine weather forecast here in just a few minutes. Looking at the entire state of Alaska, here's our first big fetch of moisture here. This atmospheric river is mostly pointed at southeast. Flooding has been taking place across Sitka. We've seen many pictures there around Juneau with a lot of ponding on top of the snow there, so not a great situation at all. And some of that may find its way into south central as we head into the next several days, especially toward the end of the weekend into Saturday. Around Sitka, a lot of water coming down there. I believe I saw more than 7 inches of rain across some parts of the coastal southeast today. So a lot of water pointed in your general direction, and that's probably not over tonight either. Looking farther north, you can see the clouds working their way over the Yukon. As we put this into motion, notice the circulation here moving up over south central, dragging in even more warmth and even more water coming through the central Gulf. The focus of the frontal boundary is working its way eastward toward Ketchikan, so this will kind of wring itself out a little bit more with some stronger winds still working through that region tonight. Back across the west, you can see kind of the early returns of the next storm system working its way south of Shemya. And again, that next surge of moisture coming in south of Kodiak will bring even warmer and wetter weather into south central. With that, that's where the freezing rain advisory comes into play tomorrow afternoon and tomorrow night. Now, snow will continue to fall across some parts of the interior tonight as that moisture spreads northward in places like Fairbanks and the eastern parts of the interior, Eagle, Northway, and even places like McGrath and along the Yukon could expect to see at least some minimal snow cover. Today's weather map shows low pressure working across south central. By late afternoon, the low was down to 972 millibars. Frontal boundary working across southeast, and satellite pictures went past this image just a little bit there. You can see it was working out toward Ketchikan in that last satellite loop image we had just a moment ago. Low pressure dropping out of the Arctic Ocean will approach the Chukchi seacoast later tonight and zip across the Arctic a little bit faster than the last one. 980 millibar low there across the central and western Gulf and south of the Alaska Peninsula. That's bringing another surge of warm and wet air there, and several other waves of low pressure across the Aleutians and the North Pacific, with scattered areas of snow across the interior, across south central, and areas of coastal rain. Some places there south of that low, making it well into the 40s today, including places like Homer. Tonight's forecast shows periods of rain and snow across the north and eastern Gulf Coast. Pockets of heavy rain are still possible there, with high pressure slowly receding around Haida Gwaii. Frontal boundary will lock up around the Alaska Range, and as that happens, it's going to keep the cold across the interior. So it doesn't look like things are going to warm up dramatically, well above freezing for the interior, though you may see a substantial increase in temperature as we go through the rest of the week. Whether that means 40 below to 20 below, that's still a pretty good round of warming for you, but it doesn't look like there's going to be a tremendous amount of heat gain there that'll put you up above the freezing point like what many places in south central are expected to see. Across the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutians, pockets of snow will continue there tonight as the front lies across the Bristol Bay region and out to the west, and another surge of colder air is building in there that will likely kind of fizzle out as it wraps around the south side of the low. Wednesday's forecast shows warmer air building across the central and eastern Gulf. Rain continues to work up toward the Gulf Coast, and all angles of attack there. You'll notice around the Kodiak Island into Prince William Sound and southeast. There may be some areas of drier weather there from time to time tomorrow before the next surge moves in. Pockets of rain and snow across south central, including the Kenai Peninsula and around Prince William Sound. And snow will continue across the Alaska Range and points northward, including areas like Fairbanks, Tanana, Nenana, Northway, and Eagle. The farther north you go, though, toward Arctic Village and into the Brooks Range, things seem to dry up a little bit, even as a cold front is working in across the Arctic coast. Areas of fog and flurries should be expected around Barrow and points eastward. Meanwhile, snow showers are possible around the Pribilofs and the central and eastern parts of the Aleutians with only minimal accumulations there. In fact, sometimes your snow may be mixing in with rain. For Thursday, the first wave will kind of fall apart there and refocus its efforts on the next storm system well south of Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula. This one barely on the chart there at 962 millibars, but notice the hefty southerly draw it's pushing toward the Gulf of Alaska and the coastline all the way from southeast, wrapping around at Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula. So waves of rain, some of that could be heavy at times, expected all the way from Ketchikan, Craig, and Klawock, all the way up toward Yakutat, probably Prince William Sound, Kodiak Island, and southward there. As this moves northward, the intensity will build as we head into Friday and Saturday. Rain and snow is possible. Some of that could be freezing rain at times, and the frontal boundary stretched across the Alaska Peninsula will ensure that most of what the interior sees, if anything, will be dealing with primarily snowfall there with a weak area of low pressure just east into the western sections of the Yukon. The front's dying out across the Arctic coast. However, the pressure gradient left behind could keep blowing snow going across the Brooks Range and parts of the western tip of the Seward Peninsula and the Bering Strait. So watch for some poor visibility there at times, picking up some snow from time to time. And across the Bering Sea, pockets of snow showers are expected there, wrapping into low pressure across the central and western parts of the Aleutians. An awful lot going on this map, and again, changes will be had in the forecast, so make sure you're staying up to date by heading to weather.gov. Here's a look at temperatures there. We're going to have to scratch off a few digits there around Angoon. That is just not that warm, and that's probably a good thing if you're in southeast right now. Low to mid 40s were the rule today. not triple-digit heat. 43 around Juneau, 41 around Haines and Skagway, 30s for most of the Yukon and northern parts of British Columbia. Across South Central, we saw readings in the 30s for Prince William Sound, 30 in Kenai, 25 in Anchorage, 38 around Homer, 39 in Kodiak there, and probably only getting warmer in the coming days. Once you got into the Alaska range, Healy and Greeley were in single-digit territory, at sometimes going below zero. You can see Greeley at 8 above, 4 below in Fairbanks. A little bit further north still around Fort Yukon, 18 below, 11 below in Arctic Village. Anaktuvik Pass was showing 17 below. The Arctic coast around Barrow and Atkasuk, almost 20 below, with Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse at 33 below, one of the colder spots on the map today. Kotzebue Sound temperatures 5 to 10 below, Point Hope, Point Lay, also running on the cold side there. 6 below around Nome, making it up to 0 earlier in the day. Southwestern temperatures were in the single digits to about 8 in Bethel. Nunivak Island about 9 above. Southwest around Bristol Bay showed 20s and 30s for the most part. The Alaska Peninsula by and large was at or above freezing. You'll probably stay there in the coming days. Northerly winds will set in across the western Aleutians, but for the most part the central Aleutians showing temps there in the 20s and 30s. St. Paul 22. Overnight low temperatures will remain in the upper 30s to lower 40s across southeast. South central mid-20s should do the trick, about 30 in Kodiak Island. The interior anywhere from 5 below to 10 below in some cases there, around 10 and 18 below. The Brooks Range should see temperatures from 25 to about 35 below. Same goes for the Arctic coast. Around Nome, 8 below. Bethel, 6 below. Bristol Bay temperatures in the teens tonight with 20s and 30s for the Alaska Peninsula. The Pribilofs around 14 and below freezing for the central and western Aleutians, with high temperatures there tomorrow just sneaking above the line. Around Bristol Bay, 20s and 30s tonight, 1 above in Bethel. Nunivak Island looking at 2 above. St. Lawrence Island around Gamble and Savunga, 7 below, with Norton Sound temperatures like Unalakleet at 2 below. Nome going to 4 below for a high temperature tomorrow. And north of the Yukon, expect temperatures from 20 below to as cold as 22 below around Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse. So conditions may not be quite as cold as they were today. However, don't forget that wind chill advisory there that could make it feel like 50 to 55 below. North Wayne Eagle will be slightly warmer tomorrow. Around Prince William Sound, 30s and 40s there. And for southeast, those temperatures are warming into the lower 40s for you on Wednesday, I should say. Flying weather, well, it'd be nice if it was someday, wouldn't it? Flying weather shows high fire conditions all the way from Haines and Skagway and around Juneau, all the way into Prince William Sound, the southern parts of the Kenai Peninsula, including Wasilla, let's try that again, Homer and Seward, with Wasilla and Palmer in MVFR conditions, and IFR conditions stretching across Bristol Bay and north of the Alaska Peninsula, and again ahead of the next storm wave that you see south of the eastern Aleutians. Back across most of the Bering Sea and across the western Aleutians, MVFR conditions are expected. Same goes for the Beaufort Seacoast and north of the Yukon, mainly east of and north and east of Fairbanks and east and including Fort Yukon. Here's a look at your pass conditions now for Anaktuvik Pass and for Adigan Pass. You'll see VFR conditions there, but Adigan Pass may start out at MVFR as we start up your Wednesday. See, I got it right this time. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, IFR conditions are expected there throughout the day. Rainy Pass is expected to be instrument flight rule, and Windy Pass should maintain MVFR through most of your Wednesday. Isabel Pass expected to be marginal throughout most of the day. And with more moisture moving in, we've got one spot that's actually improving a little bit through the day, heading toward VFR conditions in Mentasta Pass. That will change as we go through the rest of the week. Tanita Pass, MVFR, trending toward IFR conditions for your midweek. And Portage Pass, as you would expect, with copious moisture moving in, Portage Pass should be IFR conditions as well as probably windy at times. Chilkoot and White Pass, IFR conditions are expected there. Freezing levels then, the surface freezing line is dropping southward once again across the western Bering Sea, but for the Gulf Coast, it's trying to move northward. And as it does so, we're probably going to see more overrunning than any movement of that really cold air at the surface. So the initial onslaught of that warm-up is going to bring that potential for mixed precipitation and freezing rain, especially around Gulf Coast communities in South Central and probably Prince William Sound. As that moves northward, out to the west, you'll see the surface freezing line jog southward even more with the northerly winds kicking in. Icing potential, there will be some, and there were many reports today of at least light to moderate rime, especially around south central, southwest, and even southeastern Alaska. So a number of freezing levels should be expected over the next 24 hours, but it looks like the main areas of action probably above 3,000 feet and below 10,000 feet tomorrow. Some of that could reach occasional moderate there in south central, all the way along Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula, and that could be below 8,000 feet to above 5,000 feet. And across parts of southeast over the Gulf, above 7,000 to below 12,000 feet. So again, around the Gulf Coast especially, watch for the icing potential there. The jet stream is showing a pretty substantial trough across the North Pacific, and with that, speeds are really picking up to 190, maybe even 200 knots in some cases. As that dives southward, well, everything has to turn around and go the other way eventually, and it does, with a stronger southerly flow bringing in warm air and a lot of moisture from the subtropics of the Pacific. With that comes a pretty big warm-up that we've already seen in the weather charts, wrapping around a ridge of high pressure and sending that colder air from the interior and the Arctic eventually into the lower 48. They're already talking about another big chill coming their way, and that is not coming to Alaska anytime soon. Westerly flow across the Arctic coast, 50 to 55 knots, speeding up as it heads into the western and northern parts of the Canadian interior. And south and easterly flow coming into the eastern parts of Russia, around 50 knots, with another disturbance parked out there. At 9,000 feet, you can see that southerly flow wrapping around the ridge of high pressure over southeast. That's picking up winds anywhere from 50 to 60 knots at times. And then we have another disturbance lined up across the southern parts of the Alaska Peninsula, and yet another low across the western tip of the Aleutians. North and westerly flow coming across the Brooks Range there. Most of that's pretty light, 10 to 20 knots, but it really picks up once it moves into Canada. At 3,000 feet, you can see the stronger westerly flow across the Brooks Range. Light southerly flow coming up to Cook Inlet at this point, 5 to 10 knots tomorrow at 3,000 feet. And a south and southwesterly flow becomes more westerly and onshore across southeast between 40 and 50 knots at times. The strongest winds remain out over the ocean. 25 to 50 knot winds wrapping around low pressure over the Alaska Peninsula. And you'll notice that cyclonic flow across the western tip of the Aleutians as well, with high pressure firmly in control of the Bering Strait. Wind speeds there north and northeast around 20 to 25 knots. Turbulence, we'll have more of that tomorrow. Notice anywhere below 6,000 feet across south and western Alaska and south central Alaska, including Kodiak Island and Prince William Sound. Some of that will easily reach occasional moderate, perhaps even widespread moderate tomorrow. And for southeast, expect some moderate chop at times below 8,000 feet. That'll probably be around the Lynn Canal and Stevens Passage northward up toward Haines and Skagway, and probably Yakutat. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back in just a few minutes with your marine weather. Stay tuned.
General aviation. It's an industry comprised of 650,000 pilots flying over 200,000 aircraft. And the missions of general aviation are as diverse as its pilots and aircraft, and the individuals and businesses that own them. Unfortunately, an unacceptable number of these general aviation aircraft, their pilots and passengers, have succumbed to senseless and often tragic crashes. And the highest percentage of these crashes have been caused by human error, namely pilots making poor safety of flight decisions. What's even more alarming is that the same mistakes are being made over and over again throughout the industry. As you go through this training and watch the scenarios, we suggest that you should concentrate heavily on the error chain depicted in each scenario and how these steps ultimately lead to a crash. Ask yourself, what were the contributing factors? Were there opportunities to break the chain? Did the pilot exhibit a specific safety attitude or value system that might have influenced his decision-making? And were there direct and/or indirect pressures affecting the decisions of the pilot? Now, let's begin the scenarios. Hal was the type that is successful in everything he does. His chain of pawn and gun shops throughout the southeast United States had done very well over the past 30 years. He was not afraid of hard work, demanded peak performance from his employees, and it showed in his business results. But his greatest passion was his flying. Since the days of his first flying lesson many years prior, Hal approached his flying with a fierce intensity and desire to excel. He bought his first airplane immediately after getting his private license and began obtaining additional ratings. As his business grew, he upgraded airplanes so that he could more effectively visit his regional stores. Although the higher performance aircraft rewarded Hal's thirst for a challenge and return on investment, he most enjoyed flying them just for fun, and could often be found visiting small grass strips in out-of-the-way places. And when Hal finally sold his chain of stores and retired, He immediately sold his business airplane and bought a tailwheel sport plane, similar to what he learned in. Hal was now back doing what he enjoyed most, flying for fun. He spent some time refreshing himself on tailwheel airplane flying techniques, which did not present a significant problem to Hal, and he didn't expect it to. He also had an instructor friend work with him for a few hours, mainly to show him a few basic aerobatic maneuvers. The day had finally come when Hal was to make good on a promise to take one of his longtime friends for a ride in his new plane. His friend Larry had been looking forward to this and was ready to go. Larry had flown with Hal many times in other planes, so he was not only comfortable around small planes, but he had a high degree of confidence in Hal's abilities. Hal briefed Larry on the particulars of the new plane, and they were soon departing. The flight started quite well, and Hal and Larry were having a good time. Hal then demonstrated one of his newly learned aerobatic maneuvers, which Larry thought was great. Larry then asked Hal if they could fly over his house because he had family visiting and they knew he was flying with Hal. So Hal agreed and they found Larry's house. After a few circles, Larry asked Hal to go lower and buzz the house, which Hal did. Then Larry asked Hal to do one of those great rolls he did earlier. Hal hesitated at first, then reasoned that it couldn't be any more difficult than it was at altitude and agreed to try the low altitude roll. So on the next pass, Hal went ahead and entered the rolling maneuver.
Time now for your marine forecast, and in south and southeasterly winds will be the rule for the next couple days. Notice a stronger southerly flow across the Lynn Canal with gales there at 35 knots, a 7-foot sea. Southwesterly flow over the Stevens Passage, 20 knots with a 4-foot sea. Southeasterlies there coming up the southern interchannels, also looking at 4-foot seas, but offshore and along coastal areas, a stronger southerly flow, 20 to 25 knots should be expected all the way to Yakutat to the Dixon entrance with 15 to 17-foot seas. As you get into Thursday, the winds pick up even more outside of Yakutat, up to 40 knots with a 20-foot sea. 30 to 35 knot winds there from Gustavus and the northern entrance all the way down to the Dixon entrance, and in the inner channels 20 to 30 knot seas, 20 to 30 knot winds from the south and east with 4 to 6 foot seas there from north to south respectively. Going across south central, you'll see the stronger southeasterly flow coming into places like Seward and across the Barren Islands. Outside of Kodiak, a stronger southerly wind at 35 knots with an 18-foot sea. Easterlies inside Prince William Sound at 15 knots, and northeasterly winds coming down Cook Inlet until you get to the Barren Islands. An easterly flow there at 25 knots with a 6-foot sea, and Shelikof Straits looking at northeasterlies with a 6-foot sea. Thursday, with low pressure here across the central Gulf, look at the winds wrapping around on the north side. Those would bring in north and easterly winds all the way from Prince William Sound and up and down the Cook Inlet into the Shelikof Strait. A 10 to 20 knot wind there, 30 knots inside Prince William Sound, and 30 to 40 knot winds on the south and easterly side of the Kenai Peninsula and the north and western parts of the Gulf Coast. 25 knot winds outside of Kodiak with a 13-foot sea. The winds will be picking up on Thursday. Across the Alaska Peninsula, a south and easterly wind inside Bristol Bay with a 6-foot sea. 8-foot seas a little bit farther south down the peninsula, and southerlies coming into the south side of the Alaska Peninsula between 30 and 35 knots, 16 to 19-foot seas there. More of an easterly flow develops on Thursday. We keep the southeasterly flow inside Bristol Bay with 6-foot seas there, 12 to 15-foot seas on the Pacific side, and 7-foot seas north of Cold Bay with a 25-knot wind from the north and east. Across the Aleutians, north and westerly flow across the western parts of the chain, a 13-foot sea there with 30-knot winds and freezing spray expected in just about every zone here across the Aleutians tomorrow. A north and easterly flow running down the Bering Sea side between 30 and 35 knots, and northeasterlies on the Pacific side between 25 and 35 knots with 11 to 14-foot seas there, 9 to 11-foot seas on the Bering Sea side. For Thursday, we're still in that colder flow across the western parts of the chain, so freezing spray is still an issue. Northerlies coming into the Aleutians all the way from west to east, 25 to 30 knot winds there with 8 to 10 foot seas. And on the Pacific side, a switch to northerly flow there from 13 to 14 foot seas across the central parts of the chain, and winds up to 35 knots across the Pacific side of the eastern chain between Nikolsky and Unalaska. Watch for freezing spray as well. Across the west, a north and easterly flow coming off the continent between 25 and 30 knots. Close to the ice edge again, watch for freezing spray. 8 foot seas expected across the open areas of the St. Matthew Island waters. A northeasterly flow out of Kuskokwim Bay, and northerlies around the Pribilofs with an 8 foot sea are expected on Wednesday. A north and northeasterly flow close to the coast again on Thursday. Out of Kuskokwim Bay, a 5 foot sea is expected there. Northerlies continue around the Pribilofs with a 25 foot sea, and northeasterlies over the St. Matthew Island waters with a 9 foot sea again in the open areas. Across the Arctic coast, a north and westerly flow around the Chukchi Sea coast, 25 knots or so should be about the strongest we see in that area. Northerlies around Kotzebue Sound. North and westerly winds will be stronger on Wednesday with 15 to 20 knots of wind blowing through, and that diminishes greatly by Thursday. Behind that frontal boundary, 5 knot winds are expected. We'll keep the stronger northerly flow though coming down the western parts of the coast and the Chukchi Sea coast, especially up to 25 knots, especially inside Kotzebue Sound. Here's a recap of what's going on tonight. A lot of southerly flow moving over the Gulf Coast over the next 48 to 60 hours. It's going to be a very warm and wet and probably windy period for many interests there from Kodiak Island all the way to south central and southeast. Periods of heavy rain and occasionally snow will mix into southeast tonight and tomorrow. South central looking at freezing rain possibility developing tomorrow afternoon with overrunning taking shape, especially around the Anchorage area and the Matanuska area. Farther north still, winds will create wind chill advisories, the potential for a feels-like index of 50 to 55 below across some parts of the Arctic coast, especially the Beaufort Seacoast as the front drops in. Look for rain and snow to mix across south central and southeast. We'll primarily be dealing with stronger areas of rain and wind in the coming days, and watch for advisories, watches, and warnings on your weather.gov internet channel. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather. See you tomorrow.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
It's never too early to set expectations and goals for your child's education. The UA College Savings Plan provides opportunities that can help you reach your educational savings goals. Save in Alaska. Study anywhere. There is more information available by calling 1-888, the number 4, and then Alaska. This message sponsored by the UA College Savings Plan.